starving to death under the desert sun. A Lakota chief carried her home and gave her warmth. The buzzards found her first. I saw them circling maybe 2 miles out, low and patient, dropping in slow spirals the way they do when whatever's beneath them hasn't moved in a while. I was coming back from the eastern water hole, which had gone to mud and mineral stink, useless now, the third one in 2 months that the summer had taken. My horse, a gray gelding I called Smoke, had his ears pitched forward watching those birds. Animals know what that circle means. He slowed without me asking. I sat there a moment. The sun was straight overhead, pressing down like a hand on the back of your neck. Out here on the flats south of the ridge, you can see everything and everything can see you, and the heat off the hardpan makes the horizon shimmer and fold so that distance loses its meaning. Could have been a deer. Could have been a mule that wandered from some settler's failing homestead. Could have been something I had no business riding toward. I rode toward it. It took me 20 minutes to cover that ground. Smoke picked his way around the scrub and the cracked earth, and I had my rifle across my lap, not because I expected trouble, but because out here you carry it like you carry your hands, just part of how you move. When I got close enough, I pulled up and looked. She was on her side in the shadow of a boulder, which wasn't much shadow, maybe enough for her head and shoulders, and she'd folded her arms under her face like a pillow. Her dress was a settler's dress, once gray-blue, now the color of the dust around her. Her hair was dark and loose and full of grit. She wasn't moving, but she wasn't dead. The buzzards hadn't landed, which meant she was still putting out enough warmth to make them uncertain. I stepped down off Smoke and walked to her, crouched about 4 feet away and looked at her hands. Cracked. Fingernails broken down past the quick. Her lips were split open in 2 places and her face was sun-scorched, the skin just beginning to blister on her cheeks. She'd been out here more than 1 day. Maybe 2. I said nothing. I reached out and put 2 fingers on her wrist, and she didn't wake, but she flinched, pulled her wrist toward her chest, and I felt the pull of her against my fingers like a small animal trying to get away. That was good. That meant something in her was still working. I went back to Smoke and took the water skin from the saddle, less than half full. The eastern hole had been bad, but I'd taken what I could before the smell drove me off, boiled it that morning. I poured a small amount into my palm and came back to her, put the water against her lips. She took it without waking fully. Her mouth worked, slow and mechanical, like something her body knew how to do without her permission. I gave her a little more. Then I sat back on my heels and looked at her and decided. The camp was 11 miles northeast. Across hard ground, no shade, a man on foot would feel those miles. On horseback carrying 2 people, it would take more than 2 hours in this heat. I looked at the sky. Maybe 4 hours of this worst sun left. Then the temperature would break a little, not much, but a little. The question was whether she'd survive the ride. The other question, and I'll be plain, because I'm telling this the way it was what my people would say. I was riding and carrying a white woman I'd found dying in the desert. There were plenty of men in my band who had reasons to leave her where she was. The army posts north of us had been taking Lakota land by increment for 3 years. The treaty we'd been promised existed on paper that no bluecoat seemed to have read. My brother had been buried 6 months before, and the sickness that took him had come from a settlement 20 miles west. I'm not excusing anything with that. I'm just saying it so you understand there were 2 sides to the question of whether I picked her up. I picked her up. She was lighter than she should have been. That's the first thing that told me how long she'd been out there. She weighed less than a half-grown boy. I got her up over the saddle in front of me and she stirred, made a sound, opened her eyes partway. Brown eyes, I saw, fever in them, not focus. She was looking at my face and not seeing it clearly. I said in English, I'd learned enough from traders, and a mission school I attended for 2 winters as a young man. You are safe. I am taking you to water and shelter. You must hold on. She said something I couldn't make out. Her head dropped forward and I put my arm around her to keep her from sliding, and I turned Smoke northeast and we went. I'll tell you her name was Clara Marsh, though I didn't know that for 4 days. She was in and out of her senses for the first 2 of those days, and what she was able to say didn't add up to much. I got her back to camp in the late afternoon, the sun finally giving some quarter, and the first person I saw when we came in was my cousin Stands in Water, who was 30 years old then, and had the face of a man who'd been disappointed often enough that he'd stopped being surprised by it. He looked at me, he looked at her. He said in Lakota, "You found something." I said she was 2 days down in the flat, south of Broken Tooth Ridge. She would have been dead by dark. He said nothing more about it, which was how he showed agreement. He came and helped me get her down from smoke, and we carried her into my lodge and put her down on the sleeping mat. My daughter, Wren, she was 17 that summer and already had her mother's eye for seeing what needed doing without being told, came in and looked, and immediately went back out for water and the medicine bundle. I had been a widower for 4 years by then. My wife, Morning Sky, had died of a fever that came fast and went fast, 3 days between healthy and gone. The grief of it had changed the shape of me. I don't say that as complaint. I say it because it's true, and because the man I was when I found Clara Marsh was not the man I'd been before. I was harder, more alone by choice. I led my people well, I think. I kept them fed and kept the young men from doing things that would bring the army down on us, but I did it from a certain distance now. Like a man standing on a ridge looking at his valley, doing his job, not walking in it. I sat outside my lodge that first night and listened to Wren inside working quietly. She was giving the woman water, cleaning her face. The sound of cloth wrung out in a bowl. At some point, one of the other women came to help, an elder named Turtle Bead, who had been the medicine woman's assistant before the medicine woman died. Turtle Bead was 60-something and had opinions about most things, and she came out once and stood next to me and said, "She'll live. Her body wants to live. I've seen people with less wanting and more to live for who didn't. She must have something she's going back to." I said, "Or something she's coming to." Turtle Bead looked at me in the firelight for a moment, then went back inside without another word. She was the kind of woman who let things sit. The second day Clara's fever broke. I was at the far end of camp repairing a bridle, the leather stiff and cracking at the stitching, when Wren came to find me. She said the woman was awake and asking questions she couldn't answer. I went to the lodge. Clara was sitting up, had gotten herself up, I could tell, because Wren would have had her lying down still, and she had the sleeping hide pulled around her shoulders and she was looking at her hands, turning them over. When I came in she looked up and her eyes were clear this time. Alert. She was trying to read the room, the way people do when they don't know where they are and they're measuring their danger. I sat down cross-legged about 6 feet from her and put my hands on my knees and let her look at me. She said, "Where am I?" I told her. She said, "You brought me here." I told her yes. She looked at my daughter in the corner, who was pretending to organize something in a basket, but was watching every bit of this. She said, "Thank you." She said it to Wren, but she looked at me when she said it, like she understood which direction the thanks should travel. I said, "Do you know how long you were in the desert?" She thought about it. Said she had been traveling with a man, her husband. She didn't say husband, she said the man I was with, and they'd had a wagon, 2 horses, coming down from the Northern Territory toward a settlement where she had a sister. The man had gotten sick 2 weeks earlier, outside of a town I knew, and she tried to nurse him and lost 4 days to that. Then he died. She had pushed on alone with what was left in the wagon, and the lead horse had broken its leg in a dry creek bed. And then the second horse had pulled loose from where she'd picketed it that night, spooked by something, she thought. Coyotes probably, and she'd walked for 2 days with what she could carry. I said, "What did you carry?" She looked down at herself, said, "I don't know, I don't remember deciding what to take, I just started walking." I got up and went outside. I told Stands in Water to find out what she'd left behind in the flat if he could find the wagon. He gave me a look, but he went. She was on her feet the third day. Not far, not for long, but upright and moving, which was faster than I'd expected. Turtle Bead was annoyed about it. She'd intended to keep her resting for a week, but Turtle Bead was annoyed about most things that happened faster than she planned. I watched Clara move around the camp at the edges. She stayed close to the lodge, which was sensible. She watched the women at their work without staring, which showed more sense than most white people I'd dealt with. A pair of children, Stands in Water's boy and a girl from the other end of camp, watched her right back. When one of them, the girl, she was maybe 5, walked up and touched the fabric of Clara's dress and then ran away, Clara smiled. It was the first time I'd seen her smile. I don't know why I noticed. I was sitting 30 yards off mending a broken spoke in a small cartwheel we used for hauling wood. I saw her smile and I went back to the spoke. Stands in Water came back that afternoon. He'd found the wagon, one wheel caved in, the axle sprung, neither horse anywhere nearby. He brought back what was salvageable, some dry goods in a tin box which had kept, a small framed photograph, the glass cracked but the image intact, some clothes which smelled of mold, a Bible. I had him put it all by the lodge. Clara came out and stood over it a while. She picked up the tin box and opened it, took inventory, put it down, picked up the photograph and looked at it a long time, and I thought it was probably the dead man. Then she put it face down on the ground and didn't pick it up again. She picked up the Bible and held it with both hands. I left her to it. The fourth night she found me. I was up late, the way I usually had been since morning sky. Sleep came eventually, but it made me wait for it. I was sitting on the east side of the camp where the ground rises a little toward the ridge and you can see the sky without the campfire muddying it. Clear night. The stars in that country in summer are something. They're not decorative up there. They have weight. She came up from behind me and stopped about 10 feet away and said, "Is it all right if I sit here?" I said yes. She sat down, not right next to me, a few feet off, and she looked at the sky for a while. Then she said, "My name is Clara Marsh. I don't think I told you." I told her my name. I told her what it meant in English. The translation came out rough, but she understood it. She said, "That's a good name." I said nothing. She said, "I owe you more than I know how to say, so I'll just say it plainly. You didn't have to stop. You didn't have to bring me here. You didn't have to take care of me. And you did all of it. I want you to know I understand what that means." I said I would do the same for anyone dying in the flat. She turned and looked at me then and she said, "Maybe, but you did it for me." I looked at the stars. There was a long quiet. She said, "I heard your daughter call you something this afternoon, Father something." What was it? I told her the full word in Lakota, what it meant when the children of the camp used it. It was somewhere between father and the name you give a man who is both chief and protector, who carries what others cannot. She said the word back to me, not perfectly but close, said, "Can I use that?" I looked at her. She was serious. She wasn't making a game of it. I said yes. She said it again, looking at the sky. Then she was quiet. We sat there an hour, maybe more. At some point she was asleep sitting up and then slowly leaning sideways, and I reached over without thinking and caught her shoulder before she went over, and she woke half up and her hand came up and covered mine on her shoulder. Her hand was warmer now than it had been in the desert. She was coming back to herself. She settled. I took my hand away. She tucked her knees up and hugged herself and went back to sleep sitting there. I stayed. She was well enough by the end of the week to help around the camp. She did it without being asked and without being directed. She watched what needed doing and then did it, the way a person does who's been working their own hands since childhood and doesn't know how to sit still. She'd grown up farming, I found out later, Iowa, which I'd only a loose idea of, somewhere flat and green, very different from this country. She was 34 years old. She'd been married for 11 years to a man named Edward Marsh, a carpenter, and they'd been trying for 6 years to make something work farther west. The sister in the south was the last option. I found this out not all at once, but the way you find things out when you're living alongside someone, a detail here, a piece there, nothing asked directly. We talked in the evenings. I told her things too, about Wren, about my brother, about the water holes that were going dry and what that meant for where we'd need to move before winter. She listened to all of it without offering solutions, which most people couldn't manage. She just listened like it was something she was glad to be trusted with. On the 9th day, she said she'd need to go. She said it in the morning early, and I could see she'd been preparing to say it. I said, "Where?" She said, "The settlement, her sister." I said, "How?" She thought about it. Said she supposed she'd walk. Said it with a small pull at the corner of her mouth that wasn't quite a smile. She knew how that sounded. I said, "The settlement is 60 miles from here. There is no water on the south route until you're within 20 miles of town. On foot in summer you'd be back in the flat inside of 3 days." She said, "I know." I said, "I'll take you." She looked at me for a long moment, said, "That's a 4-day ride out of your way." I said, "I know what it is." She said, "Why?" I thought about how to say it, said, "Because I brought you in from the flat and that means you're my responsibility until you're somewhere safe. That's how it works." She said, "Is that really why?" I looked at her. She was looking back at me with those brown eyes steady, the fever gone, the sunburn faded to a weathering that would stay a while. She wasn't being coy about it. She was asking a plain question and she wanted a plain answer. I said, "No, not only." She nodded, said, "All right." We left the next morning, me and Clara and Stands in Water, who came uninvited and whose presence I was glad for even if I didn't say so. Wren watched us go from outside the lodge and she had an expression I recognized. It was her mother's expression, the look Morning Sky used to wear when she'd already figured out something I hadn't yet admitted to myself. I'd lived with that look for 18 years. Seeing it on my daughter's face did something to me. I turned Smoke and we rode. The first day was hard going. We pushed south and a little west, picking up a creek that still had something running in it, enough to water the horses and fill our skins. Clara rode her own horse, a dun mare that Stands in Water had rounded up, one of the horses she'd lost, which he'd found picketed at the base of a small mesa 2 miles from the old camp. She rode well enough. Not a plains rider, but she'd grown up on something mules. She told me, farm mules, and she had good instincts for the animal. She kept up. We camped the first night in a shallow draw. Stands in Water made a fire, small and sheltered, and we ate and were mostly quiet. He had accepted Clara's presence in the camp, and on this ride with a practicality that I thought well of him for. He had his own grief about the army, about the land, we all did, but he was not the kind of man who made one woman answer for what a government had done. The second morning he rode ahead to scout the route, which left me and Clara riding side by side for several miles without him as a third presence to speak through or around. She said, "Tell me about her, your wife." I hadn't expected that. She said, "You don't have to." I said her name was Morning Sky. She was. I stopped, looked at the country ahead of us, the plains opening out, the dry grass bending in a south wind, said, she was the kind of woman who made the whole camp quieter when she was in it. Not because she was quiet herself. She wasn't, but she knew where the peace was and how to bring people toward it. The camp was louder when she was gone. Clara said nothing for a moment. Then she said, "How long?" I said, 4 years now. She said, "Do you still look for her? In the lodge, at the fire?" I looked at her. She was watching the ground ahead of the horses. I said, "Yes." She said, "I looked for Edward everywhere for the first 3 days after. Even when I knew he was in the ground, I kept turning to tell him things." She paused. "He wasn't a bad man. He was just he wanted things to work out and they didn't, and I don't know if he ever stopped blaming himself for that. It wore him down." I said, "And you, did you blame him?" She said, "I blamed the years, the dry years, the bad prices, not him." but he couldn't always believe me about that. We rode in silence for a while after that, the kind of silence that isn't empty. The third day, we came to the salt flat. I'd known we'd have to cross it, but I'd hoped the morning would give us cloud cover. It didn't. It was open and bright and still, the worst kind of desert day, the salt reflecting the light back up from below so that you were taking it from two directions at once. The horses didn't like it. Their hooves rang on the crust and it shifted underfoot in places, which unnerved them. Clara's mare started to balk about a mile in. She worked the animal forward with patience, not forcing, the way a person works a horse who's scared, not dragging it into the fear but staying alongside it steady. I watched her do this and she did it right, better than right. The mare came forward step by step. Then Stands in Water's horse put a leg through the crust up to the knee. The horse screamed, that sound horses make, high and terrible, and went down on its side. Stands in Water threw himself clear and landed on the salt and rolled and came up on his feet. He was unhurt. The horse was thrashing, one leg caught at an angle that was going to break it if we didn't work fast. I was off smoke before I'd thought about it. Clara was already moving. She was off her mare and she'd handed her reins to Stands in Water and she was at the horse's head talking to it. Talking, not yelling. She got her hands on the animal's face and she put her whole calm into it and the horse stopped thrashing. I can't explain it better than that. The horse stopped thrashing. I got down and dug around the caught leg. The crust was only 6 inches deep, an air pocket below, the leg not broken, caught at the fetlock joint and twisted but not snapped. I worked the leg free and Stands in Water had a hold of the bridle and we got the horse up. Clara kept her hands on its face and kept talking to it the whole time. When the horse was on its feet and settled, Stands in Water looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at me. He said in Lakota, "She's good with animals." I said yes. He said, "She's good with other things too." I said nothing. He smiled, not a large smile. Stands in Water didn't do large smiles, and led his horse slowly forward across the flat. We reached the south edge of the salt flat late in the afternoon and camped in the rocks where there was shade enough for the horses. Clara cleaned the horse's fetlock with water from her skin and wrapped it with a strip of cloth she cut from the hem of her dress. She worked without drama. When it was done, she sat back and looked at it and nodded. I said, "Where did you learn to do that?" She said, "Iowa," small pause, "the mules." I said, "You did that wrapping like you'd done it before." She said, "I have. Mules are hard on their legs." She looked at me. "And you dug that leg out like you'd done that before too." I said, "I have, twice. Both times it went worse than this." She said, "Lucky this time." I said, "It wasn't only luck. You kept the animal still. That mattered." She looked down at the bandage on the horse's leg. She said, "I was terrified the whole time. I want you to know that. It didn't feel like calm on the inside." I said, "It never does." She looked up at me then, and something in her face shifted, not a big change, nothing you could point to exactly, just a settling. Like something she'd been holding up for a long time was still up, but she'd found a better hold. She said, "You mean that, don't you? It's not just something to say." I said, "I don't say things just to say them." She said, "No, I've noticed." The last day. We came off the high ground around mid-morning and the settlement was visible in the valley below, a loose scatter of buildings, the raw wood look of a place still being built, a water tower, smoke from somewhere. Clara stopped her horse on the ridge and looked at it. I pulled up alongside her. Stands in Water drifted back, giving us the space to be what we were. He was good at that. She looked at the settlement for a while, said, "My sister's name is Ruth. She'll be glad to see me. She's worried." A pause. "She's going to ask me a lot of questions I don't know how to answer yet." I said, "Answer them when you know." She said, "What would I say about this? About you? About the camp? About—" She stopped. I said nothing. She said, "Most people down there would have a certain idea about what happened. about why you brought me in, about what I was doing in a Lakota camp for 11 days. She looked at me. I want you to know I don't care what they think. I said, I know. She said, do you? I said, you haven't cared what anyone thought since the second day you were on your feet. I watched you. You were only watching to understand, not to get approval. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, that's the most you've said about me in 11 days. I said, 11 days is about right. She smiled, not the small one from the camp, a real one all the way to her eyes. We went down. At the edge of town, she stopped us. There was a well and a water trough 50 yards from the first building, and a man splitting wood in the yard who'd already seen us and was watching. Clara got down from her mare and tied her at the trough. She came to Smoke's side and she looked up at me. She said, you'll water the horses. I said yes. She said, and then you'll go. I said yes. She put her hand on my knee. Her hand was dry and warm and she pressed it against my knee for a moment, not squeezing, not pulling, just present. She looked at me the way I've thought about since, the way a person looks at you when they're deciding whether to say the full thing or hold part of it back. She decided. She said, you carried me out of the desert. You fed me when I was nothing but bones. You gave me your lodge and your fire and you rode 60 miles out of your way to make sure I was safe. You are the strongest man I have ever been this close to, and I don't mean your arms. She paused. I want you to know that I see you. Not what you were, not what the men in that settlement will say you are. I see what you are, and I will know it for the rest of my life. I sat on Smoke and I looked at her. I said, then that's enough. She said, is it? I said, for now. She kept her hand on my knee for another moment. Then she took it back and she straightened, and she looked toward the buildings where her sister's house was. She said, I'm going to find Ruth now. I said, go. She took 2 steps and stopped. She said, without turning around, my name is on that well in there. My husband bought it before he died, had the deed recorded at the land office. Ruth wrote me. It should be mine now. The deed. She paused. If the army ever pushes you south of Broken Tooth, there's water there. It's mine to give and I'm giving it. Then she walked into that settlement. I watered the horses. Stands in water said nothing, which was the best thing he could have done. We stood at the trough in the shade of the well house and the horses drank, and the man across the yard watched us, and I looked back at him without hurry or apology. After a while he went back to his wood. We turned north. I'm an old man telling this now. White-haired and slow in cold weather, with a hip that's never been right since a horse fell on it, years and years ago on a different flat than the one I found Clara on. Most of the people from that summer are gone. Stands in water died in the hard winter 2 years after. Turtle Bead outlasted him by 3 years, which she would have taken some satisfaction in. Wren has children of her own now, grandchildren. She is nothing like her mother and exactly like her mother, both at once, the way daughters get. I never took a second wife. Not for any sad reason. I don't want anyone feeling heavy for me. I was full. I led my people through 20 hard years after that summer, and I did it well, and I slept at night with the knowledge of that, which is more than a lot of men get. Clara Marsh sent word the following spring. She'd found a rider heading north and she'd given him a letter. He found me because she'd described me well enough that he knew me on sight. In the letter, which my daughter read to me because her English was better than mine for that kind of writing, she told me that Ruth was well, that the settlement was growing, that she had the deed to the well confirmed by the land office, and that she had written my name on a document that said the water was mine and my people's to use without question. That document was lodged with the land office, and she told 3 other people what it said, in case anything happened to her. She wrote one more thing at the end. She wrote that she had a name for me now, from her own language, and she hoped I would allow it. She wrote that in the Iowa of her childhood, the highest name for a man was the one they gave to the men who didn't need anyone to be watching before they did right. She wrote that she'd been around enough men to know that most of them needed the watching. She wrote that I was the other kind. She signed it with her name, and she wrote the name for me she'd chosen beneath it. It was a plain word, an ordinary word in English, but she meant it in the way that makes an ordinary word land like a hand on your chest. I can't tell you the word, some things you keep. The well is still there, south of Broken Tooth, I mean. My grandson rode to it last summer and came back and told me the casing is old, but it hasn't gone dry. The land around it has changed hands twice that we know of, but Clara's document, or the record of it, cop it out. That word about the water being ours held by the land office all these years has held. I don't know how. I know it has. I think about her sometimes, not with a hole in me, with, I don't have a better word for it in English, with fullness. With the knowledge that out here, in a life spent largely in hard country and hard weather, with grief in it and loss in it and 20 years of watching the world change in ways that cost us, there was a morning when I rode toward a circle of buzzards and found something worth finding. And she found me. That's not nothing. That's not nothing at all. The stars are out tonight, big and weighty the way they get this time of year. Smoke's been gone 30 years. He was a good horse, a steady horse, and he gave me good years, but I still feel him sometimes under me when I think about that ride across the flat. The weight of her in front of me, barely there, the heat coming off the hardpan, the buzzards lifting off behind us like they'd been held on strings that someone let go. I thought about her name those first miles. Thought about what kind of woman walks 2 days through that country on foot rather than sitting down and waiting for what was coming. Thought about what that kind of stubbornness costs you and what it's worth. Turns out it's worth quite a bit. I kept that name she gave me. I haven't told many people what it is, but I know what it is, and I know who gave it, and on the days when this world gets small and heavy, I say it to myself out here under these stars. And I feel seen. That's everything, that's the whole story.